So in the early 1900s, Georgia oystermen harvested over 8 million pounds of oysters annually. And what this meant was that Georgia was running out of oysters. So the same problem that was happening up in New England in the Chesapeake Bay was happening here in Georgia. It was over-harvesting. For the longest time, local oystermen had been doing something called reseeding oyster beds, which basically meant taking the discarded shells, taking them back to the oyster beds and throwing them overboard so that oyster spat, or juvenile baby oysters, would be able to have something to adhere to. And the idea was that if you did this, you would have a more successful harvest for the next oyster season. But it just wasn't working. It wasn't working to the scale that these canneries were just canning so many oysters that reseeding oyster beds wasn't able to keep up. So people were asking, well, what should they do? So a lot of cannery owners got together and decided that privatization of the oyster beds was the best case scenario, the best solution for this. And what this meant was that instead of a bunch of oyster beds being public access where they're open to all of the citizens of the state and anybody can harvest from these oyster beds, it meant that a specific area of land would be leased to an individual. They would be able to farm or plant their own oysters there, and then they would be responsible for taking care of those oysters, and then eventually they would be able to reap the benefits of it and be able to harvest their own oysters, and nobody else would be able to. So to figure out what areas of the rivers and marshes should be privatized, the Georgia General Assembly went and asked the U.S. government for a survey to be done of the Georgia coast and its oyster beds. So U.S. Navy ensign J.C. Drake went along on a schooner called the Ready and sailed up and down Georgia's coast looking for different oyster beds. So what he was doing was he was documenting any naturally occurring oyster bed. Those oyster beds were considered property of the state, and they were also considered public access. So a naturally occurring oyster bed could be harvested by any Georgia citizen. So what he was doing was documenting where those naturally existing oyster beds are, but then also documenting all of the empty space and the empty areas of the river and marsh. And those were the areas that would be able to be leased out in increments, I think they're 5-acre increments, to be able to go to different individuals. So the Bulletin-19 survey was done in 1890. It was put into Georgia law in 1891 as conclusive evidence, which basically meant it was the law of the land. Whatever this survey says was basically, as it stands, that was correct. And people were unable to challenge it even if the survey wasn't necessarily true. So in 1899, Georgia Congressman Walter P. LaRoche introduced an amendment to the law that did pass, and they basically said, no, if you have evidence that can challenge this survey, then you should be able to go to court and challenge the authenticity of the survey and whether or not it correctly deemed natural versus just empty kind of land in the marshes. So this is basically what started the Oyster Wars in Georgia. It was a series of court cases where African-American oystermen were going against the canneries, and basically they were suing each other for who had proper rights to different areas in the marsh. It did unfortunately sometimes result in violence, where canneries would hire armed guards to stand with shotguns in bateaus over the oyster beds and would end up shooting trespassers. And oystermen who were protesting the law and the Bulletin-19 by going out and harvesting from beds that they thought were naturally occurring beds, even though the map did not deem them as such. So the Georgia oyster industry rapidly declined in the 1930s due to overharvesting, water pollution that decimated oyster populations, cheap oysters being imported from Japan, and new minimum wage laws that basically led to a decrease in cheap labor. In 2015, the University of Georgia created a new oyster hatchery right outside of Savannah to begin experimenting with growing oysters and oyster farming. And then in 2019, Georgia finally legalized commercial oyster farming.